There was this one tale. It's a simple tale. It's a tale of a young prince and a mighty serpent. I'll start with the serpent. This is a pretty simple story for her. The serpent, she belonged to a tribe, a race of serpents, and they had a caste system to them, right? They were highly intelligent and could actually speak, both telepathically and vocally. And they're very refined, quite uncharacteristically so for their appearance. But they were very crude in their caste system, how it was determined. And how it was determined essentially just like, it was essentially shows of strength. Essentially. It was a bit more to it than that, but that's essentially what it came down to. It came down to how physically masterful they were. Because a snake is something else, right? It's got a long, slithery body that it needs to account for. It's not like a human. A human, we look down, we look behind us, and we're all just like right here. But snakes have a lot to them. They stretch on for a long time. And so like how they ascertained mastery was how masterful they were over their own body. And there's this one serpent, this female serpent called Nairu. And Nairu was heralded as the most beautiful and most refined out of all these serpents. She was also the biggest one. And she was powerful. And her voice was very... when she spoke, everyone would listen. And Nairu was peculiar though. She didn't really care for these little displays and tests, these duels of mastery between her brethren, her ilk. She didn't really care for it. She wanted something else. And she couldn't quite pin down, she couldn't quite articulate what she wanted, but she wanted something else. And the fact that she couldn't articulate it, despite her mastery over the word, her mastery over the flow, her form, she became perturbed by that. And every single male that came to her, that attempted to dominate her, would get decimated, absolutely conquered, in no time at all. In any way, or test or feat, they would fail to dominate her. Eventually got to the point where she just got up and left her tribe, made her way across the land. And now let's go to the perspective of another character in the story, the young prince. The young prince's name was Tehroki. Tehroki was a curious lad. He was a bit in the same camp as Nairu, in which he didn't really care for the traditional way or modern way of doing things. Now, Tehroki was in a curious position just like Nairu. He was a prince, and his father wanted him to select a female, a mate with which he would then make children with, and thus secure the legacy of the royal bloodline. And day after day, they would have these events, these little, how would you say, banquet feasts that would then have an event in it, and they would feast on whatever food was there, while potential suitresses, or however you say female, I don't know, females would come and line themselves up in front of Tehroki and his father, and he would look over every single one of them. And his father, Tehroki's father, would look over to him and say the same thing. To which do you gravitate? And Tehroki would slowly look over every single one of them, and every single time he'd shake his head, look over to his father's. None of these truly attract my eye, father. And that happened for a few times, a few days. It eventually got to the point where Tehroki's father, he was a bit of a sportsman at heart, and so he refined these little ceremonies in which he would tell the woman to do special things that would attract possibly his attention more. And to be like a little dance here, or a little speech there, but still to the same effect. It eventually got to the point where they would engage him outside of these ceremonies in whatever way they could. It was much the same effect, though, because, well, they were a product of the times and the environment they lived in. Still very primitive. Tehroki's people were at this point, because this took place a long time ago. A primitive culture. And the women all seemed to share the same temperament that Tehroki was just not interested in. Not in the least. And this went on for a time, until the banquet stopped, and the woman would just show up at the house, and they'd file in, and his father would be there, in the same room as him, ask him the same question: to which do you gravitate? And Tehroki would give the same, said, none of these attract my eye, father. And his father would sigh, solemnly, but ever so slightly shake his head. Didn't want to make it too explicit, because he didn't want to upset his son. He cared for his son deeply, and he wanted him to choose a mate. But Tehroki just did not want to. He did not want to. He was just not interested in it. This game, this ceremony that society, his civilization, his tribe had set up for him. He wasn't interested in it. Eventually got to the point where most of the females stopped coming. Even when they did, Tehroki's father wouldn't even be present anymore at that point. It would just be Tehroki and a woman. Sometimes they call at once. Sometimes they would try to coax him. Some of them even implied that they'd be okay with a group activity, so to speak, to put it quite politely. But Tehroki once again declined, sent them away. Tehroki became remiss with this, as his father did, because he didn't want to upset nor disappoint his father, but he couldn't go against his own nature. Now, the thing about Tehroki is that he was cunning, brilliant, highly, highly intelligent. Like, exceedingly so. So exceedingly that it interrupted his ability to even socialize and relate to most people. Because it felt quite literally alien to him to speak to someone at such a lower level. And he didn't have any kind of ego nor pretentiousness to this. He's just the way he was. And he wanted to relate. He wanted to socialize. He wanted a mate. But he could not go against his nature. It's something that he simply would not do. And all these women, he found the same quality of plainness, simplicity. They were short, small, usually dainty, one or so tall here and there. But they weren't very numerous, and even the ones that were larger or taller, too crude, too oafish, too uncaring in their expression, almost as if they weren't interested, but they wanted still the fruits of this matrimony that they surely would receive. And so they played along, and Tehroki could tell that they were playing along, that this was all just very by the books for them. And so even the tall ones that he was interested in, they wouldn't be interested in him really, truly. And he could tell. Even the ones that were oafish, crudish, and the little ones went more against his nature than the tall ones. Because he felt like he would have been marrying a child at that point, due to his intellect and how blaringly apparent his intellect would make such an exchange, such a dynamic of a relationship. It wasn't something that he wished to be there. If anything, he wished his intellect to depart from him, and allow him to just be simple and plain, like everyone else, but it would not. And it reminded him, every day, just as every day he sent away every single potential suitor. Eventually he took to just roaming the woods, bringing his spear with him to see if he could possibly catch any wild game. Tehroki wasn't a hunter at all, really. Not in the least. But in his desperation and his somberness, he took to possibly taking up this hobby, seeing if he could get lucky. He realized that he wasn't much of a hunter, and so he used his massive intellect, of course, to set up elaborate traps. One trap of which was this massive pit that he called a dead pool. And what it was is that it was set up so that it would collect a bunch of animals. And how this was set up is that there's this switch that would cave in the floor, and then once the game hit the bottom of the floor, the flap will come up and it'll be just like solid ground again. And he set this up and left back for the village. Now we come back to Nairu, and guess where Nairu ended up falling into? That same trap. And she was furious. She was delirious with rage and frustration because she was not able to get out of this trap. And Nairu ran into many traps before. She was not a stranger to the humans and the traps that they would set up. And usually, quite easily, she would outsmart them and even find ways to disarm these traps, to study them, so that she may better know them and not run into them again. But this trap was so masterfully set up that it enraged her, it frustrated her to no end. Now she was able to break the contraption that set the flap to reset, but that was about it. And that was probably most likely because of her enormous size more than anything else. Now Tehroki figured out that this trap was set off because he had a flag that was set by a little string through pulleys that intertwined between the trees themselves. That was like a notification that showed that there was something in the pit, and it moved It stretched all the way nearly to the borders of the village that he stayed in. And with his notification flag one day, he saw that it was red, and he followed the pulley string all the way to the pit. And then he slowly gazed over, peeking his head over the hole. And he said, "What lies there beneath?" He wasn't sure why he did this, but something in him told him to do it, because he sensed a sort of intelligence somehow. And then up for the pit, Nairu responded, "It is I, foul child." Nara said, with a bit of venom in her voice, and Tehroki was taken aback, because he, while he had a suspicion, did not truly expect anything to answer back. And once more, the thing that was answering back was not a human, but an enormous serpent with jet black scales, eyes that glowed in the dark, and he could only just barely tell that it was a snake because of the sheen that would come across her scales beautifully in the moonlight. He was taken aback at first, but then he was entranced by her beauty. This in itself fascinated Nairu, because usually when a human would see her, they'd be so horrified they'd turn around and start running and screaming in utter horror. But Tehroki was not the same as these humans. Instead, he was utterly entranced by her beauty and her size, and what's more, her ability to speak, not just speak plainly or crudely, but with a refined sense of diction in her voice. Nairu could scarcely believe even that she thought she saw the hints of a smile, a grin form at the corners of his mouth. And then she too became fascinated in this human, this child that was now looking down at her. Tehroki broke the silence after a while, saying, "Oh my, you are quite beautiful to gaze upon." Nairu narrowed her eyes ever so slightly, getting to the point before even the pleasantries had a chance to start up between them. "Get me out of this pit, child." Tehroki folded his arms across his chest and said the obvious, "And then have you murder me as soon as you come up? Not a chance, serpent." And Nairu hissed ever so slightly and asked, "What can I do or say to convince you that that won't happen?" Tehroki shot back almost immediately, "Nothing, serpent. You are, after all, a serpent." And Nairu hissed again, slightly more loudly this time, "Are you implying that all of us are deceptive by nature?" Tehroki tilted his head to the side and said, "No. I know that you are cunning, and that you are always looking to get out on top, looking out only for yourselves. That's what I know about you." And Nairu tilted her head in response and replied, "What do you know of my race, little child?" Tehroki then sat down, his feet hanging over the edge. Nairu was taken aback at how carefree he was, because now Tehroki seemed to be utterly entranced, and not just entranced but entertained by his own interest in this enormous serpent that lay at the bottom of his trap. Tehroki continued on, "Well, I know that you like to engage in tests or feats of strength and dominance with one another, and whoever is the more dominant gets to decide the, how would you say? He held his finger to his chin, pondering for a moment. The surname, I believe. Nairu was taken aback. How do you know that, child? Tehroki smiled, somewhat coyly, but courageously. I like to learn about things, and I think you guys are interesting. So imagine my shock when I saw you at the bottom of my pit. I've been thanking my lucky stars for every single second since we began this conversation. You have no idea. Nairu settled back, almost chuckling beneath her breath, but too quietly for Tehroki to hear, a slight smile forming on her serpentine lips. You are quite interesting yourself, child, even if stupid. Tehroki tilted his head once more. Stupid? Yes, Nairu said. If you had any sense, you would have killed me as soon as you saw me. Tehroki once again smiled, but then leveled out his grin, saying, Fear isn't something that really interests me. I find it quite boring to be fearful of things. Interest is much more productive, in my honest opinion. After this, Tehroki and Nairu exchanged words for a while. They got to know each other just ever so slightly better. And this discussion, this pattern would continue for a series of days. Tehroki would bring food for Nairu to eat from his local village, entire sheep or cattle, baby cattle, making sure that Nairu was well fed and taken care of. He'd even send down baskets that were full of moisturizing oil for her to put on her serpentine skin, and then he would bring up the basket full of her sheddings to make sure that everything was clean and nice for her down at this pit. This fascinated Nairu even more, as she was wondering what exactly did this human child have in mind for her. What would be her fate at the hands of this small captor? Eventually, at one point, Tehroki would arrive, and he'd be less optimistic. There'd be less pep in his step, less enthusiasm in the words he'd speak. This happened for a few days until Nairu, even if feigning interest, asked, "What troubles you, child? You've been like this for a few days now." Tehroki answered back, "Nothing that really interests you. It's just trouble between me and my father." "What troubles you between you and your father?" Nairu asked promptly. "Oh, nothing," Tehroki said. "It's just I've been having trouble selecting my wife." Nairu narrowed her eyes ever so slightly, having found something of relatability between her and the child, as unimaginable as that would have been. "You don't say?" Nairu asked. "I do." "What keeps you from selecting a wife, child?" Tehroki pursed his lips, shifting his eyes from side to side. Nairu could tell that he was uncertain how to phrase this next part. But last he opened his lips spoke regardless. The women, the girls, they don't really interest me. They're so plain, ordinary, uninteresting, void of passion. I can't get myself to be interested in that, he said, somewhat pensively. No matter how hard I try, I wish I was able to, but my brain is not kind to me, and won't allow me to. Nairu tilted her head, somewhat caressing her head against the wall of the pit. Tehroki was slightly taken aback, widening his eyes slightly, as he was slightly allured by her movement or expression. Tehroki felt his heart increase somewhat even. He shook his head though, regaining focus. This was indeed a beautiful serpent, but that was quite the aberrant thought form for him to be having at that moment. Nairu, luckily, did not take notice of Tehroki's irregularity and continued her response. What interests you then, child? Tehroki just simply silently looked at her, gazing into her large, slit, serpentine eyes. They were also quite beautiful. I don't know, he said. I really don't. I could word it out, but it'd come out stupidly, crudely, and that's not me. I still haven't figured out who I am, what I want. I guess I'll just die alone. Nairu silently slumped back, not responding with anything, just leaving the boy to ponder, to stew in his misery, this realization. Tehroki looked at her, not expecting a response back from her. Silently got up, dusted the dirt off of his rump, and then he let down a rope ladder, one that was big enough for Nairu to grasp onto with her enormous serpentine jaw, so she could easily ascend out of the pit. Nairu was immediately shocked and taken aback, slamming the backside of her neck preceding her head against the pit of the wall, almost as if Tehroki had launched an assault against her. Tehroki just silently looked at Nairu and said, "You're free to go now, serpent. What you would do, what you will do, you will do." He turned around and started to walk away. Nairu paused for a moment, 3 seconds, 4. She would count the amount of steps that Tehroki took away from the pit. Then, all of a sudden, with no warning, Nairu jetted out of the pit with a speed that was ineffable for even Tehroki to detect. She quickly got her entire enormous body out of the pit in no time, and then wrapped it around the little boy, quickly, without even any hesitation. Tehroki, surprisingly enough, did not put up a fight, not in the least. Nairu looked into his eyes. You could tell that the boy had given up on life, that this whole affair with his father and selecting a mate had removed any motivation that he had for living. And she found that most fascinating And then she uttered the next words that she had been thinking about for the past few days with this child. Very, very interesting, boy. You do not wish to give your seed to any woman of this earth, because you do not find them worthy. You are like me, child. You are so much like me. I dare say you might be my other. Your intellectual prowess, your dominion over this earth has been established and well fortified. You are just like me, child. Yes, just like me. And for this, as thanks for setting me free, I will give you children. And then Tehroki and Nairu, or rather Nairu, made love with Tehroki. It was uncertain to say whether she was forcing herself upon him, because Tehroki was not putting up a fight. But regardless, she continued. The father of the boy, however, had been looking for him for a while. He wanted to apologize for an argument that he had with Tehroki earlier that day, because he had said some harsh words against his better judgment. And he searched long into the night, looking for his son, yelling his name. Tehroki, Tehroki, my boy, my son, please, I want to speak with you. I wish to apologize. Tehroki, please, where are you? And finally, the father arrived, had found his son. But what the sight he would see would horrify him so immensely, he immediately cried out in pain and desperation at this enormous serpent violating his son. He then, without hesitation, grabbed a blade, a sharp dagger that was passed down in his family, and charged at the enormous serpent. Despite her enormous size, despite knowing that this beast, this monster, could easily slay him without any effort, he needed to free his son from her. He sank his blade into her skin. She hissed at him, knocked him back with her tail. It took the wind out of his lungs, and it took him a while to recover. But by that time, Nairu had already finished, and she released Tehroki from betwixt her form, and then slithered away like a lightning. His father crawled over to Tehroki, embraced his son deeply, apologizing profusely, crying, rocking his son back and forth in his arms, saying that it'll be okay, it'll be okay. But Tehroki was not in the same set of mind as his father. It was difficult to tell how Tehroki's mind was at that point. His expression was blank. He was unable to tell what exactly he was thinking. He asked Tehroki, "Child, please, my son, my child, how are you? How is your mind? That vile beast did not break you. She did not harm your precious intellect, your beautiful mind, did she?" Tehroki simply looked at him with a plain expression, slowly shook his head, said, "No, father, I'm fine," and then made a plain smile. Tehroki's father let out a sigh of relief, said, "Oh, thank God. Thank God. Tehroki, you don't ever have to choose a wife if you don't want to. You could just live with me. You don't have to. You understand? Whatever decision you decide, you don't have to." Tehroki then made an even wider smile, a genuine one, said, "Father, thank you." Tehroki and his father made their way back to the village. This is the part where we gaze into Tehroki's mind, because for his perspective, he wasn't at all scarred by that experience that he had with Nairu. He wasn't sure how he felt, but he knew that he found Nairu to be absolutely beautiful, and his beauty entranced him, even in the midst of what should have traumatized him. So he wasn't sure, but he was sure that he wished to see her at least once more in his life before he passed from this earth. The next day, an unexpected event happened once again, this time in the form of a gift. A knock came at the door in the early morning hours. Tehroki was up at that moment and went to go answer the door, only to open the door to no one at all. He looked around, and there was no one at all. For as far as the eyes can see, the whole village was still under deep sleep. Then Tehroki looked down and saw what had been left. A single egg. A very big one, roughly the size that would come up to about the knees of Tehroki. He knelt down, put his hand on the egg, and somehow knew. Nairu, you kept your promise. He picked up the egg and brought it inside. It would be difficult to explain exactly to his father what that was, and to even more so convince him to keep it. But he eventually convinced him, saying that, "Father, look, this is the son, this is my child. This is the grandchild you always wanted. Even if it is from her, it is me, regardless. They will flow with my blood, be constituted of my veins, my bones. Please, Father." And his father eventually agreed to keep the egg until it hatched. And the child that would hatch from that egg would be a hybrid. For you see, something I failed to mention of Tehroki's tribe is that they had an animal, a crest sigil that they abide by. This entire tribe that Tehroki heralded from were referred to by a simple name by every other tribe, every other village, even every other nation. They were referred to simply as the lionfolk tribe, because they were fierce and unremitting in every battle that they partaked in. They would often be hired as mercenaries from different nations across the land and villages just because of how proficient they were in battle. And as such, they were referred to as the lionfolk people. And the child that would emerge out of that giant mighty egg would be a hybrid between a lionfolk and a serpent folk. A lion and a serpent. And tales would be told of how this mighty being would be a mixture of a lion who shed its skin like a snake,